ready to sprain my ankle.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here. We're ThinkTech Talks. We're talking on a Monday between the 2 and 3. And we have a guest who was on a couple of weeks ago when he was here in Honolulu. Since then, he's traveled around the world and back to his current home, Hong Kong. That's Michael Davis. And he's a public intellectual there as well as a law professor. And he is following democracy in action or maybe in transition, not clear. And he wrote an article in the South China Morning Post, which was published on September 3rd, only a few days ago, about this very subject of democracy in Hong Kong. Welcome back by way of Skype, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Look forward to talking to you.
Yeah, well, okay, let's dig right in. So, when you were here, you described a situation that sounded like the good guys were going to win. That's frankly what it sounded like to me. Are the good guys still going to win?
I must have left a misimpression. I was very cynical at the time, and what I was cynical about is proven to be justified.
So, what is the dynamic now? We know the Chinese don't want to give in on what's happening in Hong Kong. They want to, tighten the noose a little, maybe a lot. And they're using sort of strained arguments over the Constitution of Hong Kong. So how does the fight go?
Well, as it stands right now, the Chinese government has issued its quote-unquote decision on whether to allow Hong Kong to reform its system to make it more democratic. And they've put forward a proposal that essentially allows them to vet any candidates that would run for office through a nominating committee. The nominating committee is provided in the basic law, but there's no reason that it would have to be blocking anybody China opposed. But China has set it up now in its decision that 50% of this committee, which is mostly pro-Beijing, has to approve of any candidates that would be submitted to the voters. So the basic law itself, you'll recall in our previous discussion, calls for Hong Kong to have universal suffrage. But China wants to give that term a meaning that most people in Hong Kong don't recognize. That kind of vetting of candidates that reminds us of the Guardian Council in Iran trying to decide who can run for office. So, and when they say universal suffrage, they kind of call it one person, one vote. They mean that everybody can vote, but that they'll decide who the candidates are.
And have they been, when they decide who the candidates are, I don't know if there's enough data on this, but when they decide who the candidates are, all the slate of candidates is going to follow the party line, right? I mean, it must be out in the open, huh?
Yeah, what happens, and we've had for the first three chief executives of Hong Kong, they've been chosen by something called an election committee, but it's not been submitted to the voters. So what's supposed to happen now is a more democratic process to submit the choice to the voters. But China worries that the voters will approve people they don't like, so they want to vet them. And the election committee, China is able to manage very well because the committee is 1,200 people, of which, 3/4 of them are very pro-Beijing. And China has set this up so that how the members are chosen would ensure that its supporters, they call it the pro-Beijing camp or the establishment camp, would always dominate the committee. And now they've declared that same election committee has to be effectively turned into the nominating committee. And then you need 50% of its members to nominate the candidates under this promised universal suffrage to present those candidates to the voters. So the Democratic camp in Hong Kong is in an uproar, and they're outraged. Leaders of some movement, in fact, just last night, leaders of the so-called Occupy Central movement all shaved their heads. So they're in protest. They're shaving their heads, and they're going to have all these sit-ins and demonstrations and so on. So it's become rather messy at the moment. Occupy Central has promised to occupy the central financial district in Hong Kong. to essentially block it up, something like Occupy Wall Street,
Yeah.
but perhaps more substantial, and that's where it stands right now.
So let me just to go back to that one point. If you have somebody who is going to select only candidates that are faithful to Beijing, you don't really have a choice. I mean, the public is being disenfranchised that way. You can't have a democratic vote if all the candidates are locked into one position, can you? I mean,
Right.
That's not democracy at all.
Right, exactly. It's well, you saw my commentary there. That's exactly the point that's being made. That basically, if we call it universal suffrage, that word has those two words have meaning, and they're included in the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, which applies to Hong Kong and it applies under the Basic Law. And the Basic Law itself says that Hong Kong residents have the right to vote and to run for office in accordance with law. The universal standard or universal suffrage under the ICCPR, this treaty I'm talking about that applies in Hong Kong, is very explicit that it has to give the voters a genuine choice.
So what we have is
sort of the baseline.
It's a charade. I mean, what we have here is a charade of democracy. It isn't democracy, and but up to this point. Up to this point, has it been this way, or up to this point, has there been a more faithful democracy?
Up to this point, there's been no democracy. In fact, that's the point now. That China's basic law says the ultimate aim is universal suffrage. 2007, they said you could achieve that aim in 2017, which they're now writing laws for that election. And China then says, however, we're going to tell you what universal suffrage means. So the Democrats in Hong Kong take the words universal suffrage and the treaty, the Human Rights Treaty, seriously. The basic law, they take it seriously. While China sort of wants to give it any meaning it wants, recently China issued a white paper where they essentially said, we're the ultimate authority. We can interpret or amend that basic law any way we want. Of course, that ignores that they entered into a treaty that created the basic law, this treaty with Britain called the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was the treaty that turned Hong Kong back to China, specified all these things that are in the basic law. And now China says, well, the treaty doesn't matter, and the basic law, we can interpret it any way we want, and here's our interpretation. So this is why the Democrats in Hong Kong are up in arms. And this week, I noticed this weekend that the pro-Beijing people are now also coming out in droves and accusing the Democrats of blocking democracy, this Beijing model. And there's a group of anti-Occupy Central that now says it's going to have a website for people like the students. I should add a footnote here. The students are planning a boycott of classes for the week of September 22nd. So this website is supposed to report on the students. People can phone in or go online and tell the website where schools are allowing students to boycott classes so that they can put pressure on those schools. And some Democrats have called this a kind of white terror. That kind of, I don't know if it's terror because there's no violence so far involved, but it certainly is an attempt to intimidate people who are opposing Beijing's model. So things have become very contentious, and people worry that the peaceful process that Democrats have always pursued in Hong Kong, there's never been violence in any demonstrations here. We've had demonstrations of up, 500,000 people frequently, that this kind of peaceful approach may give way if the government and Beijing becomes heavy-handed in how it treats people and does, as this suggests, mobilizes opposition to sort of stand against them when they promote democracy. Then starts looking like Thailand recently, where you have different camps. So it seems this pro-Beijing camp, in fact, there were accusations when they held a demonstration recently, they were busing people from the mainland. So all of this is creating a very tense atmosphere.
Well, let me go back and see if so the treaty called for universal suffrage, and anyone in Hong Kong could run beyond the ballot. But the Chinese have said, no, we're not respecting the treaty. We'll make a law that tells you how this works, and it works where we have this committee that makes, the soft committee, that makes these appointments, and the idea that anyone in Hong Kong could run for office, we're throwing that out. Because if the treaty, I'm going to get the logic of it, if the treaty doesn't apply, then we can do what we want, and we are the boss. And you guys have to follow our committee, and you can't vote for anybody we don't put on the ballot. Is that what's happening? Is that the argument?
Well, it's kind of like that. They don't come out and say we throw the treaty out, but what they did in the white paper is say all the articles in the treaty were already Chinese policy, and it's based on our authority. So in effect, they make an argument in their white paper that diminishes the standing of the treaty. And Britain, who wants to do trade with China, hasn't really said much about it. So at the end of the day, the treaty has almost no significance, and Beijing claims total authority to decide what the requirements are under the Basic Law. The Basic Law, under the treaty stipulated the content of the Basic Law. So now China says, well, we'll interpret it any way we want. And it actually took the position that there are no international standards for universal suffrage, that they don't exist, which is rather contrary to what most people know in various treaties and so on. And then they said, it doesn't require, that everybody be able to run for office. In a sense, they're saying that vetting candidates and then letting everyone vote on them is sufficient to achieve universal suffrage. Now you can say, well, this is part of China, they can do what they want, but the Hong Kong people have been free people. And the whole idea of returning Hong Kong to China was not without controversy, given especially this treaty to turn Hong Kong back was in the early 1980s, when China was just coming out of a cultural revolution. So it was viewed with great skepticism. So these guarantees that Hong Kong people have been given are very important. They're not just important for the people of Hong Kong, but also for the international community. When that treaty was signed, Beijing officials went to all the capitals of the world to get countries around the world to treat Hong Kong distinctly from China in various trade relations and so on. So foreign governments do have an interest in it, although Chinese government now says they're not allowed to meddle in China's internal affairs, that Hong Kong's an internal affair. So Beijing seems to be sort of taking a tough line. I call it, essentially they say, we're the boss now. In 1980s, they were saying, Hong Kong people, put your hearts at ease. Now they're saying, we're the boss, and we're going to decide how this is done. And so this is, I think, causing a lot of dissension in Hong Kong, a lot of concern. I fear it may lead to immigration again. That was a problem back in the days when these issues first came up. But one wonders whether that's going to start being a problem again if there's a perception that Beijing is too heavy-handed in the way it handles Hong Kong.
Well, let me go to one thing. So when you say to them, you guys, this is not democracy. By any standard, it's not democracy. What is their logical response? I mean, it sounds very heavy-handed to say, well, no, it is democracy. It's just democracy without the opportunity for the common man to run. I mean, what's their answer to that? Do they have a legitimate, do they have any answer to that?
Well, their answer is to be something like, oh, that you guys are supported by Westerners. This argument is coming from Western interference, and this is Western-style democracy, and we don't need Western-style democracy. We're China. So it's this kind of cultural relativist argument that we're just exceptional, and we don't follow you guys' alleged rules, and that there are no international standards. And so we will do it the way we want to do it because we're sovereign, and our sovereign interests are preeminent.
Well, I mentioned last week, to an outsider, this really sounds like something they've been planning for a long time. That inherent in the return of Hong Kong was China's ultimate plan, which may be revealed now, of a Hong Kong that would be dominated by Chinese government officials in every way, and it was only just a matter of evolving it that way. And this sounds like one of the steps in the evolution, doesn't it?
Well, it's hard to say because this idea of one country, two systems was conceived by Deng Xiaoping, and he was a rather imaginative character. And in those days, China was moving towards reform. So I think there was seriousness to it. They didn't really understand perhaps the full implications of having an autonomous Hong Kong. In the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, they promise a high degree of autonomy. And I think Deng Xiaoping was the kind of guy that sort of imagined, yeah, let's do it. Let's move forward. We're going to reform in China. We're going to take back Hong Kong, and Hong Kong can have a separate system. So I think there was a lot of vision there. I don't think, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist guy, but I think along the way, it certainly evolved where Beijing officials started saying, wait a minute, we don't want this Hong Kong being too rowdy and out of our control. And I think their instinct to control sort of overwhelms the vision of one country, two systems.
Yeah, so it's a moving target.
Yeah, so Hong Kong people are taking them at their word because this is in an international treaty and they don't have a lot of choice in the matter. So they want to be optimistic and work towards the goals outlined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. But a lot of officials, and then in Hong Kong, of course, Beijing co-ops a lot of supporters who get rewarded with various kinds of, appointments to Beijing committees and this and that. And so that this pro-Beijing camp, does China's bidding in Hong Kong, and China wants to keep them in charge. So I think these things it's not so much a conspiracy, but kind of an evolving process where now the people in charge, and we know the current leadership in China is very conservative. Xi Jinping has taken over, and there's a lot of human rights problems in China itself, crackdown on human rights defenders and so on. So this trend now is to assert control, and Hong Kong is part of that. We see it also in the South China Sea and disputes with China's neighbors, also this tough line.
Yes.
So I think Hong Kong is just caught in the middle of it, and Hong Kong people are used to fighting on the street, and that's about what they're set to do, I guess.
So you say Hong Kong people, and I'd like to know who that is, because you're also talking about people who disagree or who the Chinese government can get to counter-protest,
Right.
and set up a sort of an apparent opposition to Hong Kong people. So who are the Hong Kong people, who are the, I guess, the democracy intellectuals like yourself? Who are they? Are they local? Are they European? What institutions are they associated with, and so forth?
Well, in general, there are democratic parties. These are all local people. Academics like me are an extreme minority in this process. I've been involved somewhat because that's what I do. I teach human rights and constitutional law and so on. And so I've been involved in some of these things because where my expertise is useful, my voice can be helpful. But for the most part, there are local democratic parties. There's more than one of them. And typically, the so-called pan-Democrats in Hong Kong elections, where direct elections of legislators are involved, have won about 55–60% of the vote. So 55–60% of Hong Kong people tend to be in the so-called pro-democracy camp consistently. But the electoral system for the legislature is so rigged that the pro-Beijing people still hold 2/3 of the seats, or just under 2/3 of the seats. To change the method for choosing the chief executive, it requires a 2/3 vote in the Legislative Council. Because the pan-Democrats have more than 1/3 of the seats, just over that, they are able to veto the Beijing's proposals. And so unless Beijing can peel off some of these pan-Democrats, then these proposals that Beijing has put forward in the last week or so will not prevail. And we'll just live with the existing, clearly, openly authoritarian system. And I think Democrats are prepared to veto it. So the pan-Democrats have been a majority in Hong Kong, but the Beijing camp is also, in the direct elections, especially one pro-Beijing party has consistently been able to win seats. They're well organized, so there's a minority in the public at large that supports the Beijing camp. It's consistently in the elections been a minority, but still they're there. And then there are, of course, among the elites, the people in the government that run the government in appointed positions are virtually all pro-Beijing. And the Democrats' political positions have tended to be only in the Legislative Council, where they could get voted in on only half the seats are directly elected. So this is a very complex story.
Oh, yeah.
But for the most part, the answer to your question is a majority of the people are in this pro-democracy camp by virtue of this history of voting in elections. And the pro-democracy camp has historically been able to mobilize a lot of support. Really, this anti-Occupy group, there's another twist here in that some people don't really like Occupy Central, even though they're pro-democracy. The idea of civil disobedience is distasteful to a lot of ordinary people. Some kind of maybe too confrontational approach. So some people will be opposed to Occupy Central, even though they also are opposed to Beijing's proposal. So it's not, tidy. It's a bit messy. But at the end of the day, I think Hong Kong people, majority of Hong Kong people, have favored democracy. In opinion polls, it's even been higher statistics on the rule of law, human rights, very strong support, around 90%. So the pro-Beijing people that aren't too keen to defend these values are in a small minority.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, what was it, about a year ago now, there were these protests that started over a shopping center versus a park in Istanbul. And in a matter of hours, the flames were fanned, and the government acted badly. There was violence, and then that accelerated, and before you know it, the crowds were huge, the violence were huge, there were reported deaths and so forth. Isn't that a possibility here with so many people so passionate about this, and with the government determined not to give ground, the Chinese government determined not to give ground? Aren't we on a kind of tinderbox when so many people are involved in the argument?
Well, this, of course, is the big worry. The Democratic camp in Hong Kong has held demonstrations now for decades, and they've all been peaceful. There's never been any violence. And the government has been accommodating, and generally, there's laws that allow you to give proper notice to the police, and then you can hold a demonstration and so on. And so this has all worked. What people fear is that now Beijing has taken this tough stance, and the government is not as tolerant as it used to be. These demonstrations have become a little more testy in recent years. So if the government's approach to these protests is very heavy-handed, then I think the risk of some kind of anger and so on giving way to violence becomes higher. And this is a real serious problem because some pro-Beijing people have threatened that the People's Liberation Army should be sent in to quell violence. While the government's official, Beijing, even the Beijing government's official position is the Hong Kong police should be able to handle it. There is this sort of lingering risk that Beijing may get even more heavy-handed. There seems to be a disconnect in understanding. Beijing, I don't think, quite understands how people protest, and it's not something they're used to allowing. They have protests in China all the time, but they tend to, suppress it rather quickly. So the idea of being gentle and allowing people to express their views isn't something well developed over here.
Yeah, and I guess that's a factor. I mean, what do they say? There are tens of thousands of protests on one thing or another, fanning out through Western China and so forth, many of which you never get the detail about, but because they're quashed almost immediately. And
right.
It sounds like, the central government is very good at quashing protests, one way or the other, maybe finding the leadership, and dealing with it right now. So,
exactly.
You wonder if they will apply that kind of strategy in Hong Kong.
Yeah, well, so far they've not, and Hong Kong has had huge demonstrations. Some of them, like the ones we were involved in 2003 over national security laws, had 500,000 people on the streets, and the government withdrew the bill. And some people resigned. And so, for the most part, the level of tolerance of public dissent has been very high in Hong Kong. And what we worry is that with this more hardline approach that Beijing has expressed in the white paper and now in this decision, that these conditions could change. I think there's some concern about this, and I think it bears watching.
What about the daily life of the average citizen in Hong Kong? What about the economy of Hong Kong? What about the man on the street? Is this affecting his ability to go to work? Is it affecting his his personal economy in any way, his daily life?
Well, so far, no, not seriously. I mean, the way Beijing runs Hong Kong, which is one of the reasons the public is a bit outraged by Beijing interference, has tended to favor developers and various capitalists. In fact, a pro-Beijing professor from the mainland recently said the primary goal in Hong Kong should be to protect the capitalists, the entrepreneurs. And so, strange coming from a communist official or academic, but yeah, I think that kind of attitude has meant that the gap between the rich and poor here is very high. There's a ratio for this in Hong Kong is one of the highest in the world, as is true of the mainland China as well. So there is this gap. But Hong Kong also has pretty good social welfare with a lot of public housing, healthcare, and so on, public healthcare that the U.S. lacks. And the rate of unemployment here is lower than the U.S. It's only, I think, around 3 or 4%. So Hong Kong steams ahead, and the economy works. There are these problems with gaps in wealth and social welfare problems, but I don't think that unusual. It's quite common in the world today.
Yeah. Well, what about the world in general? Which because of people like you writing, and I'm sure this gets in all the media because there's so much activity around it. I mean, so right now any look at Hong Kong is defined by what's happening about democracy there. It becomes iconic in its own way. People want to know what's going on, but they also maybe want to express something. Maybe other states in the West, perhaps, have expressed concern about the loss of true democracy in Hong Kong. Is there, I want to call it public, in terms of international public pressure on this issue, trying to weigh in on it, trying to affect it?
There is, it's a mixed bag. What always happens in these kinds of cases is the same kind of economic interest you mentioned a moment ago.
Okay.
Compete with people's principles and ideals. And the Tibetans have known this for years, and Hong Kong seems to be sliding into the same groove. It was interesting, on the day China issued its white paper, the Chinese premier was meeting with the Queen of England. And this was a very special privilege afforded him. And the British signed, a huge trade deal. And so this is not all by accident. I assume the Chinese know very well that you dangle enough trade advantages that you can silence criticism of their human rights policies. And this has been a perennial problem, I think, for U.S. foreign policy in dealing with human rights in China. That is U.S. economic interest on the one hand versus these principles that we stand for, and they always compete with each other. So far we haven't seen a huge outcry from foreign governments for this very reason. There's been these comments being made, and of course Beijing slaps them all down as foreign interference. And so I think really a lot of this depends on Hong Kong people. And that they understand that. I think they're grown-ups and they have a free press, very free press, and so they know sort of all these nuances. And so they also know that if they want to win, they have to make their cause visible. And so that's why you get things like Occupy Central and protests. Things that may not be able to happen in mainland China can happen here, and that's sort of the distinctive quality of Hong Kong.
Yeah, part of the recipe is to get in front of the media and have the media reported not only in Hong Kong but around the world, and achieve some sort of resonance around the world. But I would offer you this thought: no event these days has very long in the news cycle. They come, they go. In 2 weeks' time, it's old news.
Right.
And while the Hong Kong people may want to keep this pot boiling until the Chinese get off their position, they may find that world opinion moves to other places, other issues. I mean, today there's all this action about Congress wanting to take affirmative steps against ISIS, for example.
Right.
that's gonna suck up all the oxygen in the media for a while. So
Oh, yeah, this has always been the case. And Hong Kong amazingly does stay in the news more than most places, certainly more than any place of equal size. So it does have a capacity to get attention. I can tell because the minute these things start happening, I get calls from all the international press to ask for my opinion on this or that. So, and I know that this comes and goes, but I think for the most part, there will be lingering attention. It's the question, certainly it will occupy a sort of Asian media, and it will compete with these other stories that you've mentioned. And that's, of course, everyone knows this, so that also causes people to try to raise the temperature to
right,
get
to
it.
catch up with it, yes.
Right.
So, one thing comes to mind is that, up till now, you've had a fairly civilized debate in Hong Kong on this issue. I mean, yes, people in the street, but no violence, and a lot of it being played out through a free press. But wouldn't you be concerned that somewhere along here, aside from creating counter protests and the like, the Chinese government may seek to limit the free press, may seek to make incursions on the free press? I know that's very important in Hong Kong, and it's a great British tradition that was left behind. But wouldn't you be concerned that one of the things the government could do, the Chinese government could do, is start pushing the free press around?
It's already done that. We've had instances of leading editors being beat up on the street. There's pressure recently on a leading publisher of one of Hong Kong's leading newspapers, Apple Daily. These things, there have been continuously these kinds of things. There's boycotting or blacklisting of certain newspapers for advertising by mainland Chinese companies, and then pressure on foreign companies not to advertise with those newspapers. So Hong Kong has multiple newspapers that are widely read. And so the one that Apple Daily, for example, will not get any advertising from any Beijing company, or in some international companies will treat it the same way. So so then a kind of self-censorship emerges in the media because of this sense of where the money's at and who you're going to displease. But in spite of that, I think there's enough there are enough principled journalists to keep going at it, and this editor that was recently in the news, Jimmy Lai, head of Apple Daily, has increased his donations to the Occupy Central, and he promised to join it. So I think so far so good. That it's not jackboots marching through the streets of Hong Kong, but a kind of political dance where some people do stand up for Hong Kong's principles and other people cave and other people represent Beijing. So that's the messy sort of scenario that so far is unfolding.
One of the things that occurs to me is that after the return in, was it 1999? No, I get that year right, 97. That was 15 years ago, and there's another generation in the air. There's young people who were they were not sentient at the time. Now they're just picking up on this, just hitting the age of working and taking positions on issues like this, and they think differently, I would imagine. Also, those people, more than their predecessors, are involved in social media. They're involved in the internet and email and websites and what have you, where you can pass information and make a statement, if you will, to millions of people without hardly trying. That must have an effect on what's going on, don't you think?
Oh, it's very big. The change is dramatic. When I first came to Hong Kong, young people virtually knew nothing about politics. I'm talking about 17, 18, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. Now, many of the leaders of this Occupy Central movement and these various protests, boycotting classes, are 17 to 20-year-olds. There used to be a little concern that the generation of democracy activists would grow old and nobody would replace them. Well, there's no longer that concern. There's a whole bunch of these young people out on the street. And when Beijing was trying to force patriotic education in Hong Kong, they took to the streets and blocked it eventually. And so they're there all the time, and they're the ones taking the lead on a lot of this current protest.
And so the young people are likely to favor democracy and likely to be more active about this issue.
Yes.
So one last question, Michael, and that is, what do you think is going to happen here? I mean, so since we spoke last, certainly this whole process has accelerated. It's more in the minds of the average person. It's more risks, more possibilities, more trouble. Is it going to get worse before it gets better, or are we headed to a time where this is all going to resolve nicely?
I think it's certainly going to get worse before it gets better. I think likely the Democrats in the Legislative Council will veto any government proposal. They've shown a lot of solidarity. If you want to organize your opposition, all you got to do is be heavy-handed. This is something the government should learn. Because these people are usually at each other's throats, but now they're very solidly in one's camp. So I would think then that we will be left with the current system. And less cooperation from the Democrats in Legislative Council, maybe more protest over time. We call it sometimes this governance problem in Hong Kong, government by crisis. The government comes up with some heavy-handed proposal and the people slap it down by going to the street. Is this going to lead to a process where there's a second thought on the Beijing side? Maybe we should find a way out of this mess? I have no idea. So far, these guys have shown themselves to be almost indifferent to Hong Kong people's concerns. We'll see.
One other thing comes to mind, which I really must ask you about, and that's this. This can't be in a vacuum as far as China is concerned. There's got to be enough media in China itself about what's going on in Hong Kong. And therefore, this could affect a lot of the thinking of a lot of people in China, maybe millions and millions, who see, the struggle for democracy and who side with the Hong Kong people, and who all of a sudden see it in different terms. And they may pose all by themselves another problem for China to deal with. If they see, for example, the Hong Kong people successful, or even apparently successful, isn't that going to create a secondary kind of echo problem for Beijing?
I think this is an argument frequently made that, well, Beijing can allow Hong Kong to evolve democratically because then everybody in China will want it. I think by being so contentious, Beijing has made the problem worse.
Yes.
If it was one country, two systems, and everyone understood Hong Kong like Washington is just a separate place that has its own form of government, I don't think there would be really too much of a spillover. It could be that Beijing officials themselves would be content and think maybe these things are good ideas. But I think when by making so much conflict in Hong Kong and generating it, they're actually making this problem worse for themselves, because then it becomes more notorious. And you're right, mainlanders become aware of it, but not from their own press, because the press is severely censored. So the result is that if this story gets to them, it gets to them through the grapevine, through the internet, through friends, people who visit Hong Kong, and so on. And I think this heavy-handedness is not in Beijing's interest. One would hope they would learn this lesson, that when they're dealing with a free society, they can't use the same tactics they use in the mainland. But so far, it seems not to have sunk in very well. And we're going to have to stay tuned.
Yes, we'll have to stay tuned. Thank you, Michael Davis, law professor and public intellectual in Hong Kong, joins us by Skype, keeping us current on the events there around the definition of democracy, Chinese style. Thank you so much, Michael.
You're welcome.
Aloha.
See you, Jay.